We're going to get to two in a moment.
Hi, Mr. Lynn. Hi, Mr. Lynn.
Oh, good God.
You just called Mr. Wayne.
Yeah, I know. I've been called a lot worse, so I can deal with that. So we are going to pick up today with Supreme Court talk. Hey, guys. Yeah. Good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
Always good. I didn't get anything from the cafe.
Huh?
Didn't get anything from the cafe.
Listen, I left one for you. Good.
Okay, Dylan. There's this little boy that like, he has lunch. Here I work. He looks exactly like you. Like, I'm so serious.
Is that
He's
his brother?
no.
My
I
brother's
asked-
in.
I was like, are you related to Dylan in 11th grade? He's like, no. I was like, do you have any relatives in this school? He's like, no. And I was like, but like, I'm serious. He's the mini version of you.
Right, you haven't seen my brother, have you?
No.
No, my brother is literally a mini version of you. Right.
No, but like, he's the mini. Like, I'm so serious. And like, I find it crazy that he's not really good.
All right, ladies and gents, I've handed everybody a Supreme Court case study. This is going to be first. Now, we're going to do this as we move throughout the year. We're going to do some case studies on the Supreme Court because a lot of your regents is going to focus on Supreme Court cases. This assignment that I've given you is basically a reading with 5 questions on the reading and on the topic of Marbury versus Madison, which is the most significant court case that will occur during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. It's monumental. We're going to talk a little bit today why it's a monumental and significant court case. I would like you guys to read the worksheet and answer questions 1 through 5 on a separate sheet of paper. If you can complete that for Friday, okay? If you can complete that for Friday's class period. You don't need to hand the sheet back in. I just need your answers numbered 1 through 5. And we're going to start a little bit today talking about that Supreme Court case. I have shared with you today a new packet electronically, but we're going to resume packet 1 from yesterday and finish that up. We're going to go, I think, through slide 13. So pick up at slide number 8 of your packet from yesterday. We're talking about the highlights of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Anna, what presidency is Jefferson? Which number president? He's our third. Okay, he was elected in 1800. We're going to look today at continue looking at the highlights of his presidency, and one of those Jefferson presidency highlights is going to be a Supreme Court decision which happens under his watch in 1803. This Supreme Court decision will almost certainly be referred to on your Regents exam in one capacity or another. So it's important that we have this. It's a landmark case. If you see that term landmark related to Supreme Court cases, it means that it is a very, very important Supreme Court decision. Landmark. It affects a lot of people and affects the country moving forward. The Supreme Court decision is going to establish the principle of judicial review. And judicial review is basically the belief that the function of the Supreme Court is to determine if laws are constitutional. And this decision in 1803 by the Supreme Court is going to assert the power of the court system as preeminent over the states, or preeminent over state laws. And the Supreme Court decision, Marbury versus Madison, we'll see in a moment, is also going to establish the Supreme Court as an equal partner with the executive branch and with the legislative branch of the government in 1803. Before that, there were three branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative, but the judicial branch was kind of like the idiot sister or the idiot brother who their powers had not been clearly established yet. With Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court asserting its power basically made the Supreme Court a co-equal branch of government along with the legislative branch and the executive branch. I can't stress this enough. This decision basically is going to give the Supreme Court the authority moving forward after 1803 to judge whether laws are constitutional. Okay, and there's been a number of important cases since that have continued this precedent. But Marbury v. Madison is a landmark decision. Okay, landmark decision. And I've given you a reading on this that I'd like you to complete for Friday. You 5 short answer questions. You don't have to. It's not. I'm not looking for anything too wordy. But 5 basic questions about the significance of this decision. The Marbury v. Madison involves a series of judges and appointments that John Adams made on his way out of the presidency in 1800. And one of those guys is going to be a guy named Marbury, and he's going to sue, and it's going to end up at the Supreme Court. And again, the important principle decided here is judicial review. The decision basically is going to give the court the authority in the future to establish whether a law is constitutional. That power had not existed really before 1803. There was a Supreme Court. It was established in 1789, but the Supreme Court's powers were kind of in limbo before Marbury versus Madison. Nobody really knew what the Supreme Court's powers were and what they weren't. Okay, this case firmly establishes the Supreme Court as a co-equal branch of government, able to check and balance the powers of the other 2 branches. Okay? If, for example, Alyssa, the Supreme Court is determining whether a law is constitutional, what branch of government is it limiting or checking if it says that a law that was passed is unconstitutional? What branch of government is it checking or limiting? Legislative branch. The legislative branch makes laws. If they pass a law and the president signs it into law and the Supreme Court 2 years later says, wait, this law was unconstitutional, that is a check or a limit on the power of the executive branch, which signed the law, and the legislative branch, which passed the law. Has everybody got that? I've got a video link here that you can watch on your own, but I would recommend when you access the video, watch this video clip before you do the handout. This video, it's a short one, it's 5 or 6 minutes. It will help you answer the questions on that worksheet. Okay? All right, let's continue on. Black remote. Let's talk about this idea of judicial review. It allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. All right? It allows the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. We'll talk more about other cases, but Marbury v. Madison is the first. And also, as I said, it strengthened the role of the judiciary in the government. It elevated the role of the Supreme Court. It elevated the role of the judicial branch because, as I said, up until 1803, everybody knew that there was a Supreme Court, but no one really had a handle on what the Supreme Court's powers were. This establishes the power. Now, when this decision was made, who do you think is going to be squawking and balking at it? Congress is going to say, whoa, wait a second, and for a couple of years, people were up in arms. But 50 years later, by the 1850s, the idea of judicial review was firmly established within our nation's government. it ensured the supremacy of the Constitution as well. So the Jefferson's presidency and judicial review, this idea of judicial review is going to ensure the supremacy of the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Okay? And it assures the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is in a lot of ways going to be able to overrule or to exceed the powers of the individual states. When we call the Constitution the supreme law of the land, okay, here's why. The Constitution guarantees rights to every American that no state laws can violate. For example, if I am an employer and I want to hire and fire somebody on the basis of their skin color. Let's say as an employer I decide I'm not going to hire blacks, okay? If I'm an employer in New York State and I make that decision, I am violating a federal law which says that I will not discriminate on the basis of what? Skin color, race, okay? So a state does not have the power, a state or an individual within a state does not have the power to violate someone's laws if those laws have been protected under the Constitution. Under the Constitution, you cannot discriminate based on a number of different factors. You cannot discriminate based on someone's race, okay? You cannot discriminate based on someone's wealth. You don't have to own property to be able to vote. You don't have to own land, okay? And if, for example, Ani, you come to the polling place in New York and I'm working at the election booth on election day and I tell you that in order for you to vote, you need to slip me a $5 bill and I'll let you in the polling place to cast your ballot, that would be a violation of federal law. Whether a law like that exists in New York State, I'm sure there is one, but if there isn't, I could still not violate her right because that is a protection that every American citizen is afforded, regardless of what state you live in, okay? Regardless of what state. So the judicial review establishes or ensures the supremacy of our Constitution as well. Now let's talk about expansion and growth during, and I'm going to whip through these kind of quickly so we can get to our next PowerPoint. Thursday, I tell you yesterday, library, Thursday. Expansion and growth. During Jefferson's presidency, we saw rapid economic and population growth. Americans are going to move westward in large numbers, largely as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, which is really going to open the floodgates for Americans moving west, okay? Much to the chagrin of Native Americans who are basically going to be forced off of their lands as Americans expand westward. And the expansion is going to be fueled by new lands and new opportunities. Jefferson, let's put it this way for you, if you want to put anything down for your notes for this slide. Jefferson oversaw westward expansion, and Jefferson was very, very hostile in terms of his policies toward Native Americans. Jefferson's policies toward settlement west was no friend to Native Americans. He would pretty much disregard Native American rights to land and to territories, and this is kind of odd because Jefferson personally, as a president, as a human being, Jefferson worshipped Native American culture. He had a room in his home dedicated to Native American culture and to Native American art and to Native American way of life, but that really didn't translate as president. While he valued Native American culture, as president he did not really respect Native Americans, and his policies toward expansion kind of reflect that. So just understand that Americans are going to be on the fast track moving west during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Country's expanding, country's growing, it doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase, and Jefferson is going to encourage Americans to move west. Is he going to encourage agriculture moving west, or is he going to encourage people to get involved in industry and manufacturing and banking and finance? Agriculture. He's going to be a proponent of agriculture. All right. Impact on Native Americans. Now, I think I've hinted at this through my comments, but westward expansion is going to lead to displacement of Native Americans, and conflicts and treaties are going to often result in loss of Native American lands. And the conflicts and treaties are going to result, more often than not, the treaties will be presented to encourage Native Americans, to really force them to move. And most of those treaties, by and large, would be violated within a period of years. When it came to more Americans arriving and more Americans coming and more Americans needing more and more land, the treaties that were signed 10 years ago are going to be treaties that are, as far as American settlers go, treaties that are out of date and they need to be shoved aside. And there was really not a lot of consideration given to the treaties that were signed with Native Americans. The treaties more or less paid lip service to Native Americans. At the time they were being forced to move, here's a treaty. Here's a treaty. We're going to give you an area of land 300 miles west of here to live and to call your own, and then 5, 10, 15 years later, as more and more Americans arrive, guess what? Those lands become expendable oftentimes. And that's going to be a familiar refrain as Americans move west. It is a blemish, it is a blotch on our history that Native Americans are going to suffer this type of treatment on a repeated basis. But it's consistent with the idea that as more and more European settlers come here, as more and more Americans come, as more and more people come from Europe to become American citizens, the reality is settlers are going to need land, and Native American lands were often taken as a result of that desire for land. And the consequences for Native Americans were not generally regarded. Long-term impact on Native American cultures and societies is going to be a gradual destruction of Native American culture and Native American way of life. As Native Americans are forced off their lands, it changes them. It forces them to have to adapt their way of life. It forces them to have to create and alter and put aside maybe prior traditions and prior aspects of their culture that might not be suitable in a new place. They might, in other words, have to become farmers rather than hunters and gatherers. They might have to live in other types of dwellings maybe that they're used to based on where they're being forced into. So there's going to be a long-term impact as well, and that long-term impact is going to be a dissolution or a diminishing of the Native American population. Diminishing of the Native American population. Jefferson's presidency, you're going to be asked this, promise you on the Regents, promise you on my the next test you have for me. Jefferson's presidency was one that is not going to be kind to the Native American groups that inhabited the continent. His legacy on Native American treatment is probably not as bad as Andrew Jackson's, but close to the policies, or close to being as bad as Andrew Jackson, who we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. All right, questions on Native Americans? Foreign policy, okay? Jefferson and his foreign policy, he's focusing on, again, maintaining neutrality in European conflicts. Jefferson wants to avoid, at all costs, the United States getting into war. What yesterday did we talk about that would make it perilous? What fiscal policy of Jefferson's that we mentioned yesterday, Palin, would make it kind of perilous for the United States to go to war anyway? Before that, what does Jefferson do to the size and scope of government when he assumes office that would make going to war a risky proposition if there were fewer soldiers and fewer sailors?
He shrinks it.
He shrinks government. He shrinks government, meaning when I say he shrank government, basically the cost for the defense of the country had been greatly diminished. There weren't nearly as many soldiers and sailors, so Jefferson wants to steer clear of war for not so much wanting to maintain neutrality, but because the United States is really not in a position to go to war. That doesn't mean war is going to be avoidable. War will not be, war will eventually occur, but Jefferson is trying as hard as he can to maintain neutrality. Now, focusing on neutrality in European conflicts means the United States is trying not to get involved with Britain and France's fights. Britain and France are still hated enemies. They're at war. And as you might imagine, Britain and France are hostile to American shipping industry because America is continuing to trade with both Britain and France while those countries are at war. And because America is trading with both Britain and France, their ships, American merchant ships, are becoming the targets of attacks by both British ships and by French ships who do not want the United States trading with their enemy. France doesn't want the United States trading with Britain. Britain doesn't want the United States trading with France. And both countries are taking steps on board the high seas to prevent American ships from engaging in trade with the other. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the United States is helping with weapons. They weren't. It doesn't mean the U.S. is helping with soldiers. They weren't. But if I'm trading with Alyssa, who's French, and I'm trading, let's say, for example, food, she's French, I'm American, and America's trading with France with food, that food is not something that can be used to fight a war, but food is something that can be used to feed soldiers and people, which can make warfare possible. So the two countries do not want the United States trading with each other. So what's going to happen, Jefferson is going to, we're going to talk a little bit about this today, Jefferson with Congress is going to narrowly pass an embargo act in 1807 aimed to avoid war, but it will end up hurting American trade. An embargo act, okay, an embargo act from your reading is basically ceasing trade with foreign nations. The Embargo Act is going to cease all trade with foreign nations. And this seems like the perfect way to avoid war, and it kind of was. But for a country that is involved in commerce with European countries and is reliant on European countries for a lot of its goods and for a lot of its wealth, what might you think the Embargo Act, or what group of people do you think the Embargo Act is really going to alienate in the United States?
Fishermen.
Okay, you say fishermen. Okay, all right. Merchants who no longer have markets overseas to trade or sell their goods. In an attempt to stave off warfare with France and Britain, Jefferson kind of shoots himself in the foot by doing this Embargo Act, because what he's effectively doing is he's basically telling American merchants and American business leaders and people who rely on trade for a living, he's basically telling them, in order to stop the war, we're going to have to cease all trade. And this is going to affect people where it hurts, in their pocketbooks. We talk about like inflation today, and we talk about the cost of gas, and we talk about the cost of groceries. Well, this is an issue. This Embargo Act is really going to piss off Northerners, especially Northerners who are involved with trade with Britain, okay? Especially countries, or especially countries with like Britain and France, where the United States is actively involved in trade. Well, the Embargo Act is going to stop all international trade, not just with France and Britain, but with all, and the United States merchants are going to be adversely affected by this, all right? But he did this because he wanted to maintain peaceful relations with other nations. There will be a cost to the Embargo Act. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Question, Blake. All right? Yes or no? Okay, Embargo Act prohibited American ships from trading with foreign ports. It was intended to pressure Britain and France to respect American neutrality. And as you might imagine, it had negative economic impacts on the United States. Port cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, okay, Newport, cities along the eastern coast, Charleston, South Carolina, all these places are going to suffer due to a lack of trade with these foreign nations under the Embargo Act. Some people will smuggle, some people try to find their way around the Embargo Act, but generally speaking, it was disastrous for American merchants. And it is a blemish on Jefferson's presidency. If Jefferson's high point was the Louisiana Purchase and the doubling the size of the United States, probably the low point of Jefferson's presidency in terms of moves that cast him in an unfavorable light with the American people, it would most certainly be the Embargo Act of 1807. All right. Let's talk about his legacy. His legacy. What? He expanded U.S. territory and influence. He strengthened the federal judiciary. The judicial branch, again with Marbury v. Madison, under his watch in 1803, is going to be elevated to a true equal with the other two branches of government. And he promoted the ideals of republicanism, lowercase r, that's not accidental, that's intentional, and simplicity. When we talk about republicanism, Jefferson was a proponent of republicanism, meaning Jefferson believed strongly in the right of the people to choose their leaders. Jefferson believed strongly in the right of the people to choose their leaders, and if those leaders were not getting the job done, Jefferson believed the power to change those leaders rested and resided in the people. He also stressed, as we mentioned yesterday, this idea of simplicity in agricultural, in what's called an agrarian economy. That was the future as far as Jefferson concerned, and he really didn't see America's. Now he understood that America had to have manufacturing, and America had to have trade, and America had to have industry. But his future, the future of the country, he felt was best going to be served by farmers and by agriculture. And this argument is still goes on today in our country. The argument between whether America should focus on its industrial might or whether America should focus on its agriculture. But ideally, when both are working and both are functioning, the country is that much better off. It shouldn't be one or the other. And Jefferson didn't feel it should be one or the other, but he felt the emphasis should be on agriculture. He was down to earth. He was a farmer. He was a planter. That's why. Okay? That's why. All right? All right, so let's flip over to, if you would, to packet 2. All right? Packet 2, which I shared with you on your stream today, it should be second or third down on your stream. It's titled The War in Europe. We're going to get a little deeper dive into the war in Europe today. And is it on your stream, guys? Is it appear like the others as well? Did I share it as an assignment or as material? I don't think it's an assignment. It's just I should have shared it as material, but it should be up there. And let's open up to the first page. The title of the new packet, and we're going to continue on, is War in Europe, and how that we're going to do a deeper dive on how the war affects the United States and Jefferson's president, and how the war affects commerce, how it affects trade. Okay, we're going to explore the impact of European wars on American commerce. We're going to understand Jefferson's foreign policy decisions, and we're going to analyze the consequences of the Embargo Act. When we talk about foreign policy, Haley, what are we talking about? If we were to talk about foreign policy decisions of Jefferson's, we're talking specifically about what? Decisions that he's making that are related to America's relationship with foreign nations. What would the opposite be of foreign policy decisions? Domestic policy decisions. So we talk about domestic, we're talking about decisions that affect people at home. And we talk about foreign policy, we're talking about the United States' relationship with other nations around the world. So let's kind of dive into this. Jefferson is going to aim to protect American interests abroad. Now, here's the high wire. Here's the challenge for Jefferson. Okay? Jefferson, as our third president, is trying to project the United States as a legitimate world power. He's trying to project the United States in the world as a country, as a republic that can stand on its own, while at the same time acknowledging that the United States really shouldn't and doesn't have the capacity to be involved in major war. So what's going to happen to make sure America has the protection that it needs on the high seas? Jefferson is going to send warships to combat pirate attacks that were happening in the Mediterranean Sea north of Africa. And these Barbary pirates, as they were called, were basically assaulting American ships and basically forcing Americans to pay bribes, okay, in order to trade. And the United States was not a nation that was going to be told that they had to pay bribes. And so Jefferson is going to send Marines. He's going to send Marines to the Mediterranean to address this issue of the Barbary pirates. So while Jefferson wants to avoid war, and Jefferson wants to keep America, what's that N word, neutral, okay, he understands also that if American ships are being attacked, he has to be he's forced to take some type of action. He has to take some type of action. He can't let ships become molested at sea without doing something to prevent it from happening. So he's going to negotiate eventually with Spain and France to keep the Mississippi River open. He wants to make sure that the Mississippi River is going to remain open to allow American ships to sail up and down with their trade goods. All right, so these are the couple of things that he's doing. He's sending warships to combat Barbary pirates in North Africa, and he's actively negotiating with Spain and France. He's using ambassadors, he's using diplomats, okay? Presidents use diplomats, they use ambassadors to negotiate for them, but he's negotiating with Spain and France to keep the Mississippi River open. He wants to maintain, now here's why this is important. Jefferson, knowing agriculture is the key to America's future, knowing agriculture is kind of what he sees as America's future, he believes that if the United States has control of the Mississippi, American farmers can do what? Ship their goods and trade their goods around the world, and trade their goods around the United States. Ideally, what's going to happen, if you look at the map of the United States, okay, pull the map down real quick. If you look at the map of the U.S., the Mississippi River comes out in the Gulf of Mexico, okay? Mississippi River comes out in the Gulf of Mexico, and farmers in the the Ohio River Valley are going to ship their goods downstream on the Mississippi, and what they want to do is they want to curl around Florida, and they want to come up and they want to trade and sell to states along the border of the United States, or they want to be able to ship their goods around the world. So as a supporter of agriculture, he wants to keep the Mississippi River open, and he's negotiating for that between with Spain and France. So, you know, I say that Jefferson favored agriculture. We can see with this very thing here that he also is favoring trade and commerce, because he wants farmers to be able to what? To be able to trade, to be able to make livings as what they're selling their goods. All right. Talk about the Barbary pirates a little bit. All right. Barbary pirates, and we'll have a video clip on this as well. Barbary pirates are going to disrupt American trade in the Mediterranean. Okay. The Barbary pirates were largely a group of Muslim pirates. Okay. Muslim pirates, and Jefferson's response is going to be military action to protect trade. America believes that it has the right to, and this goes back to even before the Revolution, America believes that freedom of the seas needs to exist with respect to trade and commerce. Americans believe that they have the right to engage in commerce on the high seas. So Jefferson's response is military action to protect commerce. This is going to result in what's called the First Barbary War, which is going to last on and off for 4 years between 1801 and 1805, which coincides with Jefferson's first term in office. This is important because if you can imagine Jefferson wanting to maintain neutrality, continuing the policy of Washington and John Adams, these Barbary attacks in the Mediterranean are kind of serving to pull Jefferson like on a tug of war toward what? Toward warfare. It's pulling him away from being able to remain neutral. You know, if he had to answer the question, do you want to go to war or not, Jefferson certainly would have said, we don't want to go to war. But on the other hand, he's certainly not going to allow foreign nations and hostile actors in the Mediterranean to continue to disrupt American ships in the region. So let's take a look at our author's video on this topic. We got an author video on the Barbary Wars.
During the early 19th century, America became embroiled in European wars. Despite the desire of American leaders to stay out of the European conflicts, it was almost impossible to do so. The reason being that America very much depended on its trade with Europe for its economic livelihood. But trying to maintain trade when the British and the French, for example, were
I'm gonna ask you a question, and it's gonna require you to kind of assimilate some of the things we talked about already this year. All right, it's not gonna, it will jump out, I hope it does, but if it doesn't, just think it through for a minute. If America's relying on trade with European nations and countries around the world for a lot of its goods that it needs, what part of the United States is going to be, by, let's say, 1803, 1805, what part of the United States is going to be starting to establish itself as being more dependent on European trade for its existence than another part of the country? What part of the country is going to be more reliant on trading with foreign partners than another part of the country? Katie?
I was gonna say like the New England area.
You said New England is going to be more reliant on trade. New England is going to be manufacturing a lot of goods that they're sending overseas to trade. Who's going to be reliant more on imports coming in from other countries to satisfy their needs in homes and in their communities?
The farmers.
Farmers where?
Southern farmers.
Why?
So
What doesn't the South have a lot of? Even in the early 1800s, the growth of these are going to be lagging far, far, far behind the North. What's going to exist in the northern economy in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Connecticut, Rhode Island? Factories. New England and the northern states can manufacture their goods. Southern states are reliant on what for their economy? What? How are they providing a living for themselves every day?
some food.
Their food that is grown by
Farmers.
farmers and a growing number of slaves. Okay? The southern economy does not have a lot of factories. They do not have a lot of industry. So the southern economy is more reliant on goods to come in from other countries. Now, here's the problem that we're going to see develop starting about this time. The North can make their own goods because they have factories. The South has to import their goods because they don't have a lot of factories. And what's going to happen, the Embargo Act of 1807 is going to negatively affect Southerners real bad because they import a lot of their manufactured goods from other countries. And now they can't get manufactured goods. They have to buy them from the... Southerners can't get their manufactured goods from foreign countries during the Embargo Act. Where are they going to buy them from? From the North. And the North, okay, the North is basically going to have the Southerners over a barrel because the Southerners can manufacture their goods. Northerners are manufacturing the goods because they have factories. So the North, in a lot of ways, is going to be seen as taking advantage of the South. And here's my point. This is going to result in the start of a growing sectionalism between the northern states and the southern states. Sectionalism, okay, is the idea that the United States is not really one country, but it is actually two countries, one northern culture and one southern culture. And there's going to be a lot of animosity between those two sections of the country. And it's largely going to be animosity from the south toward the north because they see the north taking advantage of them economically. And there's going to be animosity in return. Northerners are going to start to resent and show animosity toward the South because more and more Northerners, as we move into the 19th century, more and more Northerners are starting to feel what about slavery?
They don't think it's
More and more Northerners are starting to talk about abolition, and more Northerners are starting to talk about the evils of slavery. So this sectionalism is going to create a rift between the two parts of the country. Take it away, Doc.
Fighting each other was problematic because each side wanted to prevent American ships from going to the other side's ports. In addition, the British Navy continued to practice something called impressment, whereby they would stop American ships on the Atlantic and they would examine the crew members to determine if any of them were deserters from the British Navy, and they would take them off the ship and put them on their ship and force them back into the Navy, the British Navy fighting the French. Well, this practice of impressment aroused Americans. They felt like it was a violation of America's rights on the seas. So those kinds of conflicts and the growing effort of the British and the French to prevent the United States from trading with the other countries of Europe caused eventually Thomas Jefferson as president to pass the Embargo Act in 1807.
Listen up.
It was a radical act, a radical decision, because it cut off all American trade with Europe. And of course, New England, which depended very much on that trade, on that commerce and the shipbuilding industry, they were very disappointed with the Embargo Act and protested strenuously about it. The embargo became Jefferson's greatest mistake and ultimately helped lead to what was the War of 1812.
So the Embargo Act is very unpopular. It's unpopular in the North. Now, it's unpopular in the North because, as the author pointed out, and we'll finish on this topic, Northerners were shipping a lot of manufactured goods from made in American factories to Europe. Now that trade has been cut off, how's that going to help the North? It's going to help the North in a real important way. What are we going to see the North be able to do more of now? If they can't trade for goods with Europe, then they're going to what? They're going to trade with the South. They're going to sell goods out, but we're going to start to see northern factories start manufacturing goods and make them American-made goods that they normally would have imported from where? From England and France. So the northern factories are going to have kind of a boom because of the Embargo Act, because they're going to have they have the factories to make goods, and now they can make them and sell them in the